I wanted to discuss with you what's happening within the West, because I guess my simple perspective is that the political West, as one entity, as I've seen it, it relied on specific conditions, both security and economic. That is, after World War II, the Americans provided the Europeans with very generous trade agreements and security because it had the capabilities to do so, and also because of the rivalry with the Soviet Union. After the Cold War, we saw the United States pursuing a hegemonic world order, and the partnership with the Europeans through NATO expansion was an important node in this system. Now, in the current multipolar system, we see something very different. The US has exhausted itself, it's less capable of competing with big powers like China, and it more or less needs to reshuffle the deck to gain some, well, let's say, strategic advantage. So we see the US going a little bit rogue. Meanwhile, Europe is seen now as a cost, a burden, and the US essentially must seek a greater return on investment for its empire. Thus, you see a very transactional and extractive approach towards his allies, which isn't limited to Trump, by the way. Uh, well, and all of this also, we spoke earlier, and it does surprise me as well how Europe seems to be disintegrating very fast. So I was wondering, do you see it in a similar way, or what is happening at the moment to the West? Because every week is more absurd than the previous.
Okay, I do have a very strong set of views that I have worked on for many, many years. My perspective is American. I'm sitting here in New York City. This is what I study. I was born and lived and worked all my life here in the United States. On the other hand, I am also European. My mother was born in Berlin, Germany, and my father in Metz, France. I've spoken French and German all my life. I'm interested in that. I have family in Europe. So, in a sense, I've been coincidentally pretty well placed to feel what's going on. And finally, I'm very historical. For me, the way to understand the present is in the framework of the passage of time, of historical change. So, with that in mind, let me tell you what I think is going on. The most important phenomena is not Mr. Trump or the United States or going rogue, all of which I understand the value of those ideas. But I think, to overstate it, but to make my point, the real problem here is China. And it has to be understood that China is changing everything. And what you have is a West that was not prepared for, could not imagine, and is at a loss for how to deal with the rise of China, where everything that has been tried to stop it, to slow it, has failed, with no prospect of anything in the future being any more successful than it has been in at least the last 75 years of Western history. That's the first point. Here's the second point. The United States was, as you correctly said, caught up in the great Cold War with the Soviet Union. It had hoped in the 19th century to be the great replacement of the British Empire. It had competed with Germany for that role. And in World War I, the United States and its ally then, Britain, having defeated the two efforts of Britain to prevent the American colony from becoming an independent force, the 1775 war, and then again the 1812 war. Having failed, US, UK smashed Germany as an alternative. That gave the United States the kind of opening to become the dominant global power in the rest of the 20th century. World War II cemented that relationship basically by destroying Japan, which had pretensions of perhaps shaking up the Anglo-American domination. But the Second World War conveniently removed Japan, conveniently decimated what was left of Europe as a competitor, leaving only awkwardly the Soviet Union. And so the Cold War was the recognition there was, and I'm exaggerating, but I want to make the point, there was one more enemy to overcome. You had subordinated the British Empire, you had subordinated Europe, you had subordinated Japan, literally with the atomic bomb at the end, a kind of subordination taken to the nth degree. So that left the Soviet Union, and you entered into a Cold War. Bitterly, you had to recognize that you couldn't obliterate the Soviet Union because they had nuclear weapons. And then the Soviet Union conveniently implodes on itself in 1989, 1990, 1991. And here now comes the point. It led the United States, the leadership of its political community, the heads of the Republican and Democratic Party. It led them to what's very important, a hysterical as well as historical moment. It was the moment that Mr. Mearsheimer, whom I know you know very well, has dedicated his life to understanding as the unipolar moment, a period in which the United States could plausibly imagine the fantasy of manifest destiny, that somehow God, and remember, God is important in the United States, no doubt lives here, celebrating the United States as the great hegemon of the world. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were to inherit the whole world. It would be our oyster. The neoliberal globalization program that had gotten underway in the 1970s could really take off in the 1990s and really move production out of the United States. All the dirt of manufacturing would be done in Asia and Latin America and Africa eventually, and the United States would reign supreme. Ironically, the explosions of a Muslim reaction, of a reaction of the so-called era of terrorism, in a peculiar way, reinforced this idea. The West was where things were civilized and polite and appropriate, and then the East was not only where dirty production was taking place, but where people were irrational, backward ideologically, all of it. It just, and now comes the disaster. The dust clears. We're now in the teens of this new century, and it emerges that there is yet another obstacle. It's not Europe, it's not America, it's not the Soviet Union, it's not Russia, it's not Japan, it's China. Only it's a much faster growing economic powerhouse than any of the others had ever been. And so instead of your being able to collect all of the fruits you had promised yourself, you were denied. And everything you've tried to do to China, everything, has failed. They don't slow down. This year, they will be 2 to 3 times faster growth of their GDP than that of the United States. And that's been the norm for 30 years. Nothing has stopped it. Not the Seventh Fleet, not the noise about Taiwan, not the economic agreement, none of it. Pacific Partnership, ASEAN, make no difference. That does not stop the relative decline of the United States and Europe and the rise of China, and now China with the BRICS. It's overwhelming, and there's no end in sight. And I think that has produced a kind of hysterical reaction now. At first, fear, at first, bitterness, at first, resolve to do to the Chinese what seemed to have worked against the Soviets. But it doesn't work. China isn't the Soviet Union in very important ways, economically, politically, and everything else. And so there's hysteria. And the hysteria reaches its apogee in a very peculiar way. It produces in the United States a clown as president, a clown whose humor, whose bizarreness really is a reaction to everything I've just said. He is going to break all the rules. He is going to behave in all the ways you're not supposed to. He is willing to ask and answer questions that were out of the realm of allowable political discourse in this country. Are Mexico and Canada important allies? Not particularly. If we can squeeze some tribute out of them in the short run, that's all they're good for. And if we have to use our military, fine. We have enough military, and they are weak enough. We can do that. And the same applies to Western Europe. We gave them military protection because we needed a buffer with the Soviet Union. We don't need that anymore. The Soviet Union isn't the kind of threat we once thought it was. In fact, our better bet would be to try to pull them away from China, which nothing we've done so far has been able to do, but we should try to do that. And a good compromise in Ukraine would help solve that problem. And that's why we're going to pull out of Ukraine. We'll leave the Europeans, who we know can't do it on their own. They haven't the military capability. They haven't had it for 50 years. It's silly. The Russians have no reason to go, and the Europeans couldn't defend themselves anyway. So let's convert them into a short-term benefit. Let's go to von der Leyen and say, here's the deal. We're going to hit you with terrible tariffs. If you don't want terrible tariffs, we're willing to give you moderate tariffs, but only if you commit to do two interesting things. Buy our liquefied natural gas, $700 billion over the next 10 years, and contribute another $700 or $800 billion in guaranteed promised investments in the United States. That is, we want you politicians in Europe to go to your people, to take the money you generate in your economy, deprive your own country of reinvesting it, and put it instead in our economy, and we will tell you where and how and when to put it. That's a serious proposition is what matters. That von der Leyen went for it tells you how bad it is, how horrible the subordination of Europe is that is contemplated here, because the chaos in Europe that could produce as you desperately try to hold on to your social welfare when what you've just agreed to precludes it. There is no way you can do what you promised Mr. Trump and rearm against Russia and hold on to your social safety net. 5 minutes of arithmetic will show you you can't do that. So the United States is saying, we don't, I'm going to exaggerate now, but we don't care about the long run. We don't know what's going to happen in the long run. Time is on China's side, not ours. We've learned that over the last 30 years. We need a short-term fix. And for that, we need to drain our empire, our informal global empire, the richest parts of which are the other members of the G7. and we're going to drain them dry. Europe, Canada, Japan, and Mexico, we're going to drain them all. And we're going to use that to make one last profound effort to stop the phenomena of China and the BRICS, which is what's going on. And here's the irony. There is a residue, and here I would like your response. Correct me where I'm wrong. There is a worry, and the worry is Europe. There is an outside chance in the American mentality that the Europeans could be so insulted, so outraged by what is being done to them, that they will actually overcome their nationalistic inability to unify, which has been on display now for so many years. It's hard to imagine everybody doesn't see it for what it is. There is, however, a risk that you will be so destructive of what their future is that you will actually bring them together. And then there's a danger they will want a place in the world economy. They don't want Russia, China. They don't want the United States. They want their own. And how are they going to do that? Well, here's the irony. One of the things they need is a place to develop energy, to develop rare earths, and to develop a whole new economic support. And so the conclusion was reached, I believe, in Washington, that the danger to Greenland was never China or Russia. That's just, if you pardon me, bullshit of the first order. The danger was that the Europeans would understand what they have if they could unify to develop it. The United States wants Greenland, in short, so that Europe cannot get it. That's where we are. And it's one of the things that is driving this kind of behavior, which is derogatory to Europe in every way, not just saying the things it says, not just mocking Starmer or Macron or Merz, not just in your face with the green, the attack on Denmark and on Greenland and all that it represents. These are symbolic acts, absolutely. Part of the denigration, absolutely. But they are also strategic moves to position yourself for the final effort to constrain Russia and China now together. Your failure against China having been, in part, bringing Russia closer rather than further away. Terrific mistake that he blames on Biden, which is silly because it comes out of a consensus in this country. But he's desperate. He will say whatever he has to. You should see Mr. Trump as a desperate politician, because that's what he is. There isn't brilliant planning. There isn't clever maneuver. There's desperation, which can sometimes give you a moment of genius, no question. But it is desperation. That's key here, not the genius moment in an otherwise desperate piece of theater.